Hey Wisecrack! Helen here. Today we're going to talk about a film that explores the beautiful dynamics of a happy, loving family with zero trauma to speak of. Just kidding. We're talking about Hereditary, a movie that makes Thanksgiving at the Bluth House look like a Norman Rockwell painting. Hereditary immediately established director Ari Aster as a bona fide horror maestro. But it's worth asking, what makes a movie about your typical family one of the most disturbing horror films in recent memory? The answer has nothing to do with naked cults, demons, or dark arts, and everything to do with your DNA. Don't worry, we'll explain in this Wisecrack Edition on Hereditary. And of course, spoilers ahead. But first, since we can't count on Paymon for our riches, we need you. At least until we find a suitable host. For $2 a month, you can get ad-free access to all of Wisecrack's videos before anyone else. That's like 2 spicy potato soft tacos, which you won't be able to eat anymore anyway. For a little more, and still substantially less than your whole family dying, you can also hang out with the Wisecrack team and other patrons on our exclusive patron Discord. Click here or go to patreon.com/wisecrack to check it out. And now, back to the show. Hereditary centers around artist Annie Graham, who is sort of in mourning over the death of her estranged mother. Before she can even process that loss, though, her daughter Charlie is killed in a freak car accident while her son is at the wheel. As Annie's whole world subsequently crumbles, a mysterious woman teaches her to perform a seance that channels Charlie's spirit, and that's where everything goes a little, off the rails. Eventually, we learn that Annie's dead mom was part of a totally bananas pagan cult that is looking for a vessel for its favorite demon. By the end, pretty much everyone is beheadedly worshipping Charlie's spirit, which has been planted into Peter's body. So why is it so scary? Well, partially because it contains stuff like this. But horror films that really shake us tend to anchor even their most supernatural scares in our real-life fears. In Hereditary's case, the clue is in the name. It's the story of a family doomed to misery by their lineage. While most of us probably don't have to worry about our grandmothers being secret occultists, the idea that we might suffer for our parents' sins is pretty universal, and that universality has everything to do with Hereditary's scare factor. See, some of the most unhinged events of the film can be explained by the concept of repression, one of the cornerstones of Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic theory. Repression is the process by which the conscious mind is shielded from feelings and thoughts which are too painful to acknowledge. These buried emotions are left to fester unresolved and often manifest themselves in occasionally alarming ways. Like, this. Indeed, Annie is a case study in repression. Her life has been littered with tragedies that she is unable to fully confront. In her eulogy for her mother, Annie tries to find nice words to say, but inadvertently ends up stressing how emotionally unavailable and controlling she was.
My mother was a very secretive and private woman. She had private rituals, private friends, private anxieties.
Annie's true feelings bubble beneath the surface, too repressed to be articulated and too powerful to be let go. This is pretty blatant foreshadowing. Annie doesn't know how sinister her mother's private rituals were, or that the strange faces she sees in the pews are actually members of Ellen's cult. Right from the beginning, the things that the Graham family hides are sowing the seeds of their own destruction. Annie's repression makes honest communication with those closest to her difficult, if not impossible.
If it gets too cold, come back in.
Just need to sleep.
The only place she'll talk about her traumatic past is at a grief support group full of strangers. Even then, she's completely detached, reeling off the laundry list of horrifying things that occurred during her childhood in an almost casual way.
She didn't have an easy life. She had DID, which became extreme at the end, and dementia.
I'm not finished yet. There's more.
My older brother had schizophrenia. And when he was 16, he hanged himself in my mother's bedroom. And of course, his suicide note blamed her, accusing her of putting people inside him. So that was my mom's life.
It's notable that Annie finishes this speech by distancing herself from the narrative. These are her mother's traumas, not hers. Even when acknowledging her family's history, she's unwilling to accept it as part of her story. Annie's not unique in her inability to deal with tragedy. During what Freud calls the first use of the psychoanalytic approach, the patient, Anna O, was encouraged to make poetical compositions that could offer her relief from her chronic anxiety, using art to express what she couldn't say out loud. Fittingly, Annie's art functions in the same way. She makes miniature doll houses that recreate her traumatic life events. However, it's not accurate to call Annie's creepy model home therapeutic. Freud emphasized that it's not enough to artistically depict traumatic events. The patient also has to engage with the emotions attached. Even as Annie recreates her past traumas in minute detail, she refuses to acknowledge the emotional payload they carry, something which becomes ghoulishly clear after she creates a bleak depiction of Charlie's death and Peter's role in it.
It's not about him.
Oh, no?
No, it's a neutral view of the accident.
But Annie's strange behavior is ultimately understandable. She's coping with her trauma all on her own. When tragedy strikes, we hope to lean on the people around us for support, often relying on a stable familial structure to hold us together. However, many modern familial units are really not set up to deal with such severe emotions. In fact, many aren't really set up to deal with emotions at all.
Don't you swear at me, you little shit! Don't you ever raise your voice at me! I am your mother!
And that brings us to what really makes Hereditary so scary: family. In the surprisingly whimsical bestseller Families and How to Survive Them, Dr. Robin Skinner and British comedian John Cleese elucidate why talking openly with our loved ones can feel so impossible, and its lessons become all too relevant in Hereditary, which is all about people who are fundamentally unable to survive their own family.
They're all like pawns in this horrible, hopeless machine.
The book centers on the premise that most of our attitudes and characteristics are grounded in our original family experience and relationships, and argues that repressed people tend to form family units that are also repressive, i.e. the Grahams. Annie and her husband, Steve, lie to one another rather than dealing with upsetting emotions. She hides the fact that she is going to a grief support group, and he hides the fact that her mother's grave has been desecrated. This chronic inability to communicate soon comes back to haunt them.
What was it?
Just some billing crap.
Okay, well, I'm gonna go see a movie.
The perpetual secrecy that hangs over their relationship leads to mistrust and even paranoia, as when Steve accuses Annie herself of being responsible for desecrating the grave.
You dug up the grave. It was you, wasn't it?
What?
All those nights you were pretending to go to the movies.
Here, the staggeringly toxic results of family-wide repression become abundantly clear, and the same is true for the Grahams' children. After the grandmother's funeral, Annie and Steve try to prompt Charlie and Peter to open up about their feelings, to no avail. Not surprising given their parents' reluctance to honestly voice their own emotions. Charlie is repressed to the point where she barely talks, responding to emotional stimuli with a strange and truly terrifying clicking noise instead. She is particularly unable to express anything negative or confrontational. When forced into an argument, she simply concedes,
That's okay.
and we learned that her practice of suppressing emotions started very early.
You never cried as a baby. You know that?
Peter, on the other hand, buries his emotions under a cloud of marijuana smoke, numbly sleepwalking through much of the day. His parents do the same, popping prescription pills to blank out their own feelings. So, what happens when you make 4 deeply repressed people share a home? You know, stuff like this. The Grahams are completely cut off from one another emotionally, compartmentalized into separate rooms, as if in one of Annie's miniatures. Even in the wake of Ellen's death, the family is more concerned with how they are supposed to feel than how they actually feel.
Should I be sad?
You should be whatever you are. It'll come.
As a result, the Grahams are totally unequipped to deal with Charlie's death, which is made gallingly clear by Peter's decision to cocoon himself in bed, leaving his parents to discover her body. He is so unable to process the trauma and his role in it that he simply shuts down. In an emotionally healthy family, the trauma of Charlie's death, though intolerably painful, could be the impetus for self-reflection and even growth. In Life and How to Survive It, another book written by the doctor-comedian duo, Skinner explains that the healthier people are, the more they are willing to admit to their limitations, and so the more open they are to the possibility of improvement. But But the Grahams were emotionally unhealthy even before the tragedy. In its wake, they are unable to reckon with the pain or even ask for help. In the rare moments when the Grahams do talk about their feelings, it gets ugly fast. In one exchange, Annie projects many of her own problems onto Peter while refusing to recognize them in herself. Even at this explosive moment, she continues to repress her feelings, specifically her guilt about Charlie's death.
I can't accept, and I can't forgive, because nobody admits anything they've done!
What about you, Mom? She didn't want to go to the party. So why was she there?
But Annie's inability to get in touch with her feelings isn't some kind of moral failing. It was somewhat inevitable. Skinner talks about how many of our painful experiences are ultimately a simple consequence of family history over which no one had any control. For the Grahams, this is certainly true. Their grandmother ultimately dooms them, but not just because of her pagan machinations. Rather, her most potent legacy is her emotional detachment, which continues to drive her family apart even after she's gone. In this sense, the Grahams are beset by a very real family curse. They each inherit the repressive tendencies of their parents, which causes their trauma to fester until it's out of control. As Annie explains in her eulogy, her mother was an emotionally distant person, unable to offer her the love or support that she needed. Fittingly, Cleese argues that many of our problems are really childhood difficulties that we failed to resolve when we were young, and consequently carry around with us in our adult lives. It's no surprise then that Annie inherited a complex, damaged idea of what it was to be a mother, which in turn instilled a deep fear of becoming one. She represses that fear though, burying it in her unconscious so it can only manifest in her dreams.
I didn't feel like a mother.
Both her dreamed confession and her murderous sleepwalking are byproducts of these unwanted, unthinkable ideas. Annie remains unable to accept them as parts of herself. Even after she almost burns her children alive, she refuses to admit the severity of the situation.
And I was standing there with a box of matches and an empty can of paint thinner. And I woke myself up striking the match, which also woke Peter up, and he started to scream.
To do so would mean acknowledging the part of her that wanted to harm her children, shattering her already tenuous maternal identity.
I mean, I was just as shocked as he was. And it was impossible to convince them that it was just sleepwalking.
Unable to process her childhood traumas, she replicates them. She unwittingly neglects her children, even giving Charlie to Ellen in a desperate attempt to win the approval she still craves.
I didn't let her anywhere near me when I had my son, which is why I gave her my daughter, who she immediately stabbed her hooks into.
And in turn, she creates kids who are just like her, repressing their traumatic childhood experiences to preserve an image of normalcy. Peter and Charlie can't confront the idea that their mother tried to kill them, or in Charlie's case, functionally gave her away, any more than Annie can. So the whole family continues stumbling forward in willful ignorance. And this is where the freaky supernatural elements of the film become so important. The family's increasingly creepy experiences are symbolic of their dysfunction. As a result, they are blinded to all the signs that something sinister is brewing. Even as they each individually notice markings and apparitions, they are unable to communicate about them for fear that their sanity will be called into question. In fact, Ellen's pagan tendencies only go unnoticed in the first place because of how distant she and Annie are. When she dies, all her secrets are there to be discovered in a box in the attic, but no one finds them until it is too late. Fittingly, the fraught emotional associations Annie has with her mother ensures she won't do the work of sorting her belongings or her own emotions. This lays the groundwork for Ellen's creepy friend, Joan, to enact the later stages of their plan. Sure, they have hundreds of years of demonic knowledge and mystical energy on their side, but their plan would be a non-starter if Annie had taken a brief flick through her mom's old things. The family's maladjustment makes them vulnerable in the first place. After drawing Annie in, Joan offers her a basic psychological defense: denial. If Annie can believe in the seance, then she doesn't have to really face the fact that Charlie is dead, doesn't have to reckon with her involvement in her death, or reconcile that with her fear of motherhood. So long as Charlie isn't dead, that can all remain buried.
You didn't kill her, Annie.
What?
She isn't gone.
But the seance also serves a larger psychological purpose. Dr. Skinner talks about how feeling plugged into a meaningful cosmic system gives people a greater psychological balance and stability. And that's exactly what Joan's mysticism offers Annie. Her home life, her whole world has been shattered. And Joan offers her a way to piece it back together, to reconstruct her family. Of course, it is not inherently supernatural to believe that some part of the people we lose lives on in us. But sometimes it's not exactly the parts we would like. Several studies about transgenerational trauma have suggested that the descendants of those who undergo great suffering might carry the psychological markers of it themselves, potentially leaving them more vulnerable to PTSD, anxiety, depression, and other conditions. One of the first studies into this phenomenon was undertaken by Canadian psychiatrist Vivian M. Rakoff, who found that the children of Holocaust survivors showed uncommonly high rates of psychological distress. Rakoff's findings in subsequent studies give evidence to the idea that trauma is passed down not only through the influence of our parents' behavior, but through their genetic material. In this way, Ellen passes her own trauma on to Annie, and Annie passes it on to Peter and Charlie. Each member of the family has developed their own repressive mechanisms to ensure that their demons are never exorcised. Eventually, those demons will destroy them. The supernatural forces at play naturally parallel the severe mental illness which runs in the family. Demonic possession and curses, after all, have historically been used as explanations for mental health problems that could not be otherwise understood. Ellen's husband and son both killed themselves as a result of schizophrenia or psychotic depression. Although her son's claim that she was putting voices inside him raises the question of whether she was experimenting with demon raising even back then. Through these acts of violence, the family's self-destructive legacy is passed on to each member, dooming them to the same bloody fate as those who came before. Much of who we are is hereditary. It's why so many of us can probably relate to Annie and her family, feeling somewhat doomed to repeat the past and one day turn into our parents. Ultimately, the thing which locks the Graham family into their fate isn't ancient rites or mysterious ruins, but their own inability to process the trauma they have undergone. They suppress and suppress and suppress it, until it finally explodes. The violence which comes exploding out is filled with darkly poetic repetitions and reversals. Annie beheads herself in a gory imitation of Charlie's death. Her nighttime fantasies of burning a family member alive come true when Steve goes up in flames. Repression and trauma lock them into a cycle, and their tortured family history seems doomed to repeat itself until they have all been destroyed. But what do you guys think? Are we all doomed to repeat our family's dysfunction? Let us know in the comments. Big thanks to our patrons for your support, light that subscribe button on fire, and as always, thanks for watching. Peace.